All right, so this is the last unit of American One, and it is still continuing with the impact of Western development. The last unit was about the effects it had on Native Americans, and this last little bit is about the farmers and the ranchers and the settlers who moved out west. So one profession that was somewhat common in certain areas of the West during this time were cowboys. And I think that most people have heard of cowboys. I think most people have an image that comes into their mind of who cowboys are and what they look like. But those are stereotypes and mostly formed by various media or commercial type entities. So we're not just talking about like the Dallas Cowboys or the rope and riding, yeehaw spurs and all that kind of thing. Now, all of those characteristics of cowboys, though, do trace back to actual characteristics of the real cowboys. For example, they do ride horses. Their primary job was to herd cattle, to raise cattle, and then to drive the cattle. When I say drive cattle, it means to basically drive them in a group. Like there's a group of cattle, and their job is to keep the group together and get them from the ranches where they were raised to the commercial centers, really to the railroad towns, where the railroads then they could be put onto the railroads and shipped to the cities. Particularly Chicago was emerging during this time as the meat packing kind of center of the country, which is where like slaughterhouses and stuff like that were. So one of the breeds that was common, that is common in Texas in particular, is the Longhorn cattle, which you can see there on the screen. And so the cowboys, they raise the cattle, their ranchers raise the cattle, and the cowboys then drive the cattle to these towns. So the Chisholm Trail was one of the trails that was used to get from certain areas of like Texas into Abilene. Abilene was one of the major railroad centers. So that was the Chisholm Trail. The Long Drive is that time period of like of driving those cattle, and it was months, and it was hard work, very extremely hard work with very little rest. Cowboys usually worked in small kind of groups to support each other and to help each other with the large groups of cattle. As you can see in this picture here, it's difficult to get good sleep because you still have to be watching out for the cattle and making sure they don't roam away, which could be what the lassos could be used for. It could be to get them back in with the herd. So spurs, of course, on their boots were used to get the horses going quickly. So I don't mean to say that none of the images you have of cowboys is accurate, but that that they did have purposes, and that they've now kind of been turned into this glamorous kind of view of a cowboy, but it actually is a really difficult job. And there were a lot of different ethnicities that were cowboys. There were Mexican cowboys, there were black cowboys, white cowboys. It was a profession that did have a lot of different people. I feel like sometimes we get these stereotypes, and I just wanted to kind of to share that cowboys, especially during this time, was not quite what everybody always thinks about. So anyway, moving on. Why do we have some of the images of the West that we normally think about? A lot of it is from the media. Now, today we have, of course, movies and songs and like stuff like that. This would be the time that I would, in class, play Will Smith, Wild Wild West. There's the movie. I don't know if any of you have seen that. But back in the 1800s, they didn't have movies that were showing the West. What they had was something called a traveling show, which was sort of like the circus when it comes into town and everybody gets all excited and they all want to go see it. Buffalo Bill, his real name was William F. Cody. I don't know if any of you have heard of him, but he was a real person. William F. Cody, aka Buffalo Bill, was the most prominent of the Wild West shows. And so he would put together these shows that were super entertaining and exciting. Kind of think like if you've ever been to Medieval Times or something like that, but this was the Wild West version. And you'd have the cowboys versus the Indians and the sharpshooters and the cowgirls and the beautiful dresses riding the horses, and just a lot of drama around it. And when you have all this drama, a lot of it gets sensationalized, and a lot of it is not like the real West. It often left out the less exciting parts of living in the West and tried to glorify some of the others. As we see in this picture here, if you've ever heard of that kind of stereotype of the cowboys versus the Indians, that's something that was a big part of the Wild West shows. As you can see here, there's an Indian, a Native American, up on the roof shooting down at the cowboy wearing his fringe and hat and all that. And we've also got like an Indian chief here in the lurking in the woods. I hope that you can recognize by looking at this that this is not an accurate portrayal of the way things were happening in the West. It's not an accurate portrayal of the natives. It's not really an accurate portrayal of anything going on here, but it makes for a good show, and that tends to be where that story kind of gets passed down of what the Wild Wild West must have been like. Here's a flyer that was advertising the Wild West shows, and again you see like the horses running and shooting the Indians and all this kind of stuff. And I encourage you to pause for just a second and read some of the stuff that's on here describing what you'll see in these Wild West shows. Such authenticity, not at all authentic, but see how it's being advertised here. I think it's really interesting. So maybe pause and try to zoom in if you can there. So moving on, here again, another depiction of it. And again, showing the natives as savages or as, dancing around with tomahawks. I mean, these are all stereotypes that eventually make it into our culture, unfortunately, I believe, and still exist today in some degree. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Annie Oakley. She was a sharpshooter, which meant she was a girl who could shoot a gun, and she could shoot a gun better than most men. And she was discovered by Buffalo Bill and joined his Wild West show, and people, paid to come see her shoot accurately from long distances and stuff like that. There's a Broadway show now called Annie Get Your Gun. There's been songs about her and stuff like that, and movies, of course. So I don't know if you've ever heard of her, but she definitely was a real person, and she was part of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And now I'm going through just a few other people that you may have heard of. Maybe not, but if you watch Westerns or if you watch like old or things about like the Wild West or the saloons and the sheriffs and all that kind of stuff, a lot of these people were real people. So Wild Bill Hickok, he was real. He was a marshal, one of the peacekeepers in Abilene, Kansas, and he was shot playing poker. He was holding 2 aces and 2 eights, so that hand is still in poker terms referred to as the dead man's hand. By the way, the images of the saloons and the poker and all that kind of stuff, that came from these railroad towns that were like the end of the long drives that I talked about with the cowboys, that after these months of difficult, arduous journey with the cattle drives, a lot of times these towns that they came to, provided releases, provided, entertainment. They wanted to sit back and play poker and drink and do all the things that happens in saloons. So that was a real existence, and you see that in some films and stuff. Anyway, so Wild Bill Hickok, he was real. Jesse James, he was real. You probably heard of him. He was an outlaw. He would rob banks and rob trains and stagecoaches and stuff. Billy the Kid was real also. He's referred to as that. He was pretty young when he did most of his activity, I think 16, 17, 18 or so. Can't remember exactly. He was eventually shot in a shootout, but he was an outlaw. He killed approximately anywhere from 4 to 9 people. Dodge City, Kansas, Wyatt Earp was the peacekeeper there. You may have seen movies about Wyatt Earp. He was real. He is second from the left, sitting down in that picture. That's what is behind my face. You probably can't read that. But if you've ever heard of the phrase, "Get the hell out of Dodge," that's referring to Dodge City, Kansas, because there would sometimes be outbreaks of violence or like shootouts and stuff like that. So anyway, these are all real people. Now, one invention, super, super, super important to the development of less, make sure you know this, is barbed wire. Barbed wire, you probably are all familiar with it. It was invented by a man named Joseph Glidden, and it was because of the development of the railroads. As you've got all these ranchers and farmers, but particularly the ranchers with their cows, their big cattle herds out west, and the railroads are trying to come through. There's the problem with cows wandering onto the tracks. The open range of cattle herding is to allow the cows to like go wherever they want to go and eat where they want to eat and just kind of roam. But that's dangerous for the cows and the railroads of both. So Joseph Glidden invented barbed wire to fence in the different ranches, fence in the property. And what this did was it led to an end of this open range system. So this is always considered, whenever we used to have like these standardized tests, as one of the big inventions to always make sure you know. So even though we don't have a standardized test right now to be concerned about, barbed wire, definitely an important invention for the development of the West, and the impact on like the cowboys and the ranchers and stuff like that. By the way, before there was barbed wire and cows were roaming everywhere, how did you know which cows belonged to which people? That's why they would brand cattle, which was to like burn a symbol into like their flesh or their usually their flesh, maybe their ear or something like that. But anyway, there was a family that lived in Texas that refused to brand their cattle. And people said, well, that's stupid. Why would you want to do that? You might lose your cattle. And they were actually pretty smart. They said that, well, any cow that they might come across, if it doesn't have a brand, well, it must be ours, because everybody knows we don't brand our cattle. So it kind of gave them the opportunity to claim even more cattle if there happened to be one that was roaming near them. Anyway, that family was known as the Maverick family. And so now, I don't know if you've ever heard of the term maverick, but if you're a maverick, it means you don't really follow the rules and how everybody else does things. You do things your own way, and that's where that term comes from. So a little side note, moving on. I am going to pause here, even though I've still got some more time, but this is kind of a separate section on its own. So that was like the Wild West and the cowboys and all that. And so I'll pick up on the next one with the homesteaders and the settling of the plains, and more with the farmers.